And I must admit, if it had been left to me, that would have been the end of it. But for some reason, Moffat wasn't happy. And on this occasion, we had done it, and I was quite happy with the alibi, and for some reason, Moffat wasn't. He didn't like the guy, he didn't get the right vibe, whatever it was. On the way back to the office in the car, he was unhappy. Let's go after work and get the foreman as he finishes work. So we were there at 4:30 outside this building site, and as the guy came out, I think he was just finishing, we just went over and huckled him into the car and never said a word to him, I don't think. Come with us, we're going to the office. And before we'd even driven away, he had said, wait a minute lads, I've made a mistake. Hi Tom, how are you this evening?
I'm very well, Simon, how are you?
I'm good, Tom, but I've got a wee bit of a moral dilemma tonight. I did a naughty thing today and I'm looking for your counsel. You're the nearest I've got to a supervisor now, so you get the blame when things go pear-shaped. I was in the roll shop today, Nan's roll shop in Glasgow that I spoke about before. Great fans of Crime Time Inc. now. I went in to give them a wee poster about our live podcast, the recording that we're doing at Hillhead Library on the 25th of August, and they were all excited about it. So much so they got a free cup of tea and a roll and tuna, not to be sniffed at. And in any event, the big question was, especially when the chef, for want of a better word, came out the back, and she said, oh, that's great, Simon, that's great. Do we get in for nothing? And I didn't have the heart to tell them that everybody gets in for nothing. So I was excited too, and I said, yeah, you can all come for free. And they were all happy, high-fiving and happy, which is pretty much how I get the free roll and cup of tea. Do you think you can exonerate me for that? Is there any forgiveness for that?
Compared with your normal behaviour, I think that's exemplary. I'm surprised you didn't quickly write out tickets with a fiver on them and sell them to them. But you said earlier on that the tuna rolls were not to be sniffed at. Well, actually, I would advise you to sniff at them, because that's how you find out whether they're fresh.
Oh, they're always fresh in Nan's, of course.
But I'm looking forward to the 25th, and I think it will be a great afternoon. A lot of chat and a lot of banter. So looking forward to it.
What I wanted to talk to you about tonight is not completely unrelated, because in the cold light of day, it sounds terrible. It sounds like we were completely off the rails. I'll tell you the plot to it, and you'll understand, as being a senior investigating officer in major crimes. This was not a murder inquiry. In lots of ways, it was even more worrying to us, because very often, as you know, in 90-odd% of murder cases, they're domestic, they're one-offs, they're incidents that happen, turns out to be manslaughter, turns out to be a one-off incident that the person wouldn't repeat. But this is a case of sexual abuse of wee boys, rapes of wee boys in the G Division Govan area of Glasgow. And in my book, it's called The Govan Beast, because that's what the press called him at the time. Always a bugbear for us, but there you go. And what had happened was, at the stage that a major inquiry was getting set up, another one happened. So there was 2, and it became 3 wee boys who had been raped by the same guy. We're talking pre-DNA, of course, but I'm saying by the same guy because of the MO, because of the time of day, because of the locations, and because of the descriptions that we were obtaining and some of the forensic evidence that was being gathered. There was no question this was the same guy acting within 3 incidents within 10 days, from memory, 10 or 11 days. So the reason I'm saying more serious is because this is only going to go one way. With your experience with the FBI, it's true that you did some training with the FBI, is that correct? We didn't know.
Yes, Simon, I did indeed. I'm listening very carefully to your narrative. Can I ask you one question right now? When was it in the process of these 3 cases, when was it realised that they were linked? And how easy was it to link them?
I was going to say my instinctive answer there was immediately after the second one, but that's not true. And that's probably a legacy from things we have discussed here before, that senior investigators are very reluctant then to, because of incidents in the past, Bible John, etc. So I think after the second one, most of us had a good inkling that this was the same guy, but it took a couple of days for the forensic stuff, etc., to surface. And I would think within the first one. The second one was about 5 days afterwards. I would say within a week, we were settled on linking them. They became one instant room. It became one instant room at Govan Police Office. Holmes system was involved.
Oh, the Holmes. So it was in the time of Holmes. What year are we talking about, Simon?
I would say 88, 89.
The reason I ask, Simon, is I'm interested in why and when cases are linked.
Yes.
And why and when they are not linked, or dislinked, or delinked, whatever you call it. Because when you look at the history of criminal investigation, sometimes these decisions were made for all sorts of arbitrary reasons without fully looking at other hypotheses. And just examining the hypothesis is one of the things that keeps recurring. Now, were the physical descriptions of the culprit, were they similar?
Yes, they were.
So you had the same modus operandi, the same method of operation. You had very similar locations. You had a similar victim profile.
2 of the locations were within 50, 60 yards of each other in a disused railway system.
Very similar victim profile in terms of ages of the boys, etc.
Yes, within a couple of years of each other.
And then you had similar description of
9 or 10.
Yeah, similar description of the culprit.
Yes.
That sounds to me as if some of you a very good reason to link these cases. Sorry for butting in, but I just wanted to go through that.
And there were forensics, there was fibres and all sorts of things. I think there was a couple of footprints from memory. Don't know about fingerprints, but in his voice, not just his physical description, but the attitude of him and the force used, all of that indicated that we were looking for one guy here. And especially when the third one occurred, and again, it was all, you know what I mean? It's not all the same description, but you can see the thread of similarity between it, that we boys of that age, they don't get creative with these things. They're interviewed properly by people trained to do that, and we pluck from that inference from a lot of it, his voice, etc., his height, his build, the smell of him even, Tom, I remember that being a factor. I don't remember exactly what it was, but all of these things add up to detailed statements that let you know that you're, and the forensics, of course, is the clincher. I can't remember if it was the same size of foot or something along those lines, but all of these strands. You've talked about this before, about the spokes of a circumstantial case.
No, I'm glad you said that they weren't all identical description, because in cases like that, particularly when you've got young witnesses, if all the descriptions are identical, I smell a rat. What concerns me is that the statement taker is actually recording what they think rather than what the witness has seen. And if you get identical descriptions, then that to me is alarming, because no 2 children will describe people in the same way.
No 2 witnesses. We did an exercise once, I can't remember what training course I was on, Tom, at Oxford Street in Glasgow. It might have been in the very early days. It might have been my first detective training course. But there was maybe 30 or 40 of us in the room, and somebody went up to speak on stage, and a gunman came in, ran into the room from a side door, and shot the speaker on stage, and ran between us up the aisle, so we got a good look at him, and ran right past us and out the door. And of course the place is in turmoil, but it quickly became apparent that this was an exercise. And the exercise was brought together with an ID parade to see if we could identify this guy in a lineup. And it was absolutely shocking, the result of it. Because when you know what a gun sounds like, when it's in an enclosed space, even in a shooting range or something like that, that's why we wear headphones down there, earmuffs. It was shocking. I think there was maybe only 30%, and I don't know if I was in the 30% who positively identified the guy.
That was from a selected audience of police officers who are trained in observation. And you've got to assume, because they're on the detective training course, there are people who have shown a special aptitude, and it's still difficult.
Yeah, that's for sure. Back to our case in Govan. So we've got 3 side-by-side inquiries now, linked inquiries looking for this guy. The officer in charge of it, who I won't name, I think I did in my book, but I won't name him here. He had been brought in. Super was on holiday, I think, Joe Jackson, and he had been brought in from K Division, Paisley, and he was in charge. I think he was the chief inspector at the time. He was in charge of the inquiry, which is fine. Instant room was set up, statements, forensics, medical examinations, all that going on, and the instant room team, you've spoken about this before, how it takes maybe 24, 36 hours to get the cogs moving, to get the right personnel in place to manage the office, to supervise the door-to-door, all that kind of stuff that's going on. And I was neighboured at that time with the guy, Jim Moffat, who I will name because I've spoke to him since I wrote my book. And this is the funny part in the book, was that Jim Moffat and I were arch enemies, if that makes sense. I was a young detective, having come from the squad, and he probably resented that. He was from Ayrshire, which always rings bells anyway. But him and I, as it transpired, we were too much alike. And we weren't neighbours in Govan office. We were in separate teams. And we usually had to be kept apart because we just set each other off all the time. He had a mouth like a machine gun, Tom. He just was such a pain in the arse. And I rose to it every time. Most people, I think, ignored them, but I rose to it every time because I was a pain in the arse as well. And then one day...
Did you say was?
And then one day I came in and my DI, who's no longer with us, Jimmy Phelps, a wonderful guy, he said to me, "You've got a new neighbour." Because I knew that my neighbour was going elsewhere. Excited to get a new neighbour, always a big day in any detective's calendar. Jim Moffat. And he told me at the end of a shift, actually. He told me at the end of the day, and Jim Moffat wasn't there. So I was in first thing in the morning to the boss to complain about it. And the boss, I tapped his door and he said, "Come in." I went in and he said, "Don't sit down. You're not going to be here long because I've already had Moffat in kicking off. Your neighbours, on you go, get on with it." End of story. So I was kicked out the door, basically. And I later found out that it was a ploy because Jim and I were at loggerheads so much that it wasn't conducive in the office anymore. And they thought, put them together and see what happens.
See who survives.
Yeah. And it turned out to be a marriage made in heaven, as far as getting the job done was concerned, because we were so competitive, we were so alike. And what I discovered immediately, Tom, was that, you see the Gatling gun that he had, that was his mouth, it was aimed at everyone in front of him. Wouldn't matter. Sergeants, inspectors would be a wee bit more deferential, but he still had that smirk on his face and because he was very clever. He was a clever guy. And one of the most hard-working detectives, on the book detectives you could meet. Him and I would compete to get in first in the morning. It was that kind of stupidity. And we'd had a few run-ins and been split up a few times as well. But now what I discovered was that I was behind the Gatling gun. Just by becoming his neighbour, that's got quite a big significance in the police, hasn't it? Your neighbour, what would you call it through there? The same? Is it I know in Fife they used to say your neebs. What would you call it?
You would call it your neighbour or your mate. Yes, exactly the same. Yeah.
It's a very special relationship in the police and probably in other walks of life as well, where people work together so closely and rely on each other so closely in certain circumstances. But once him and I worked together, the pressure was off. We didn't argue with each other anymore. We laughed at everyone else. And probably it became 2 Gatling guns. I don't remember. But I remember that I got on well with him once I knew a wee bit about him. Because I'd never taken any time to get to know the guy. I just didn't like him. So him and I were neighbours, and we were assigned onto the team for this Beast inquiry. And within 2 or 3 days of being assigned on the inquiry, Jim and I came up with our own theory. Not really a theory about the crimes or anything like that. That was quite straightforward. But on the way the inquiry should be headed. And we didn't like the actions we were getting. We thought it was sluggish. We thought it was laborious. We thought there was a lot of wasted time and effort going in. I don't know how I'll ask you this, Tom. Do you think that in those first 2 or 3 days of a major inquiry, or maybe longer, the home system sucked a lot of resource out of the inquiry team because it had to be fed the basics, it had to be fed the initial information, it had to be looked after to lay the foundation of a protracted inquiry, if you like?
Yeah, it does actually. But of course, you've got to build a database. So you end up servicing the machine. And that, to some extent, can mitigate against a very fast-moving investigation. There's ways around that. It sounds to me as if that was at the very dawn of the home system, where everybody was struggling to get to grips with it. And you were doing everything 110%. There was no shortcuts. Now, as you got more familiar, there actually were shortcuts, and I don't mean dangerous shortcuts, but there were ways you could use the system to serve you and not you serve the system. But initially, and if you weren't familiar, you're right, it was the tail wagging the dog, and you had to be very careful that you weren't simply shoveling information into the machine and hope the machine would pop out with a name, because that wasn't going to happen. What the machine is there to do is to prevent you going down the wrong road and to make you think logically about what you were doing and whether there was. So you couldn't take flights of fancy. You and I have both been involved in investigations where that's happened. Of course, it can be lethal to an investigation. So I know exactly what you mean.
So for 35 or 36 years, I've been decrying the Chief Inspector and calling him for everything. I'm going to be a wee bit more charitable and say that he was probably caught up in that, Tom, because he probably was a wee bit out of his depth. Maybe it was his first major inquiry, for all I know, because it wasn't a murder inquiry, remember. He had been sent from K Division by his super up there. So he was maybe just erring on the cautious side and wanted to make sure that he knew that it was going to be scrutinised thereafter. So he had to make sure that he had all the I's dotted and all the T's crossed. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt now after 36 years. But at the time, Moffat and I thought, this guy's an idiot. We should be out there chapping doors because it's obvious that this guy fits certain parameters that we're looking for. He's reasonably local. He's got local knowledge, the places that were used. We're talking in daylight. We're talking about 3:30, 4 o'clock in daylight. But he had managed to get these boys into secluded areas. You'll remember the female and child unit, we called it in Strathclyde. I don't know what was that the same through in your patch?
Yeah, women and child unit, yeah.
Okay. They had sole domain at that point over crimes of a sexual nature, female victims, etc., etc. They kind of took the lead on these things. And they had an intelligence system of their own that was separate from the divisional or force intelligence, for that matter. They had a wee index card box on their desk that was a great resource because they kept it up to date for their own. There was maybe 4 or 5 of them working in there, and we knew they had this wee box locked away. So Jim and I thought, this guy's in that box.
Yeah, but Simon, can I just stop you for a minute and just take you back and just talk about this because it's interesting. You're talking about this DCI. He's taken from another division and he's parachuted into your division. He doesn't know the people and he doesn't know the strengths and weaknesses of his team. Now, had he known the particular strengths and the strength of your neighbour, he might well have cut you loose as a sort of a hunting pack. And I worked with a very good DCI who would do that. He knew that certain people had certain strengths and weaknesses, and he would meld the team accordingly. But I think you are right to give a lot of forgiveness to that DCI because he realised that if he made a mistake, and if a mistake got into the system in the early days, that system would corrupt. That mistake would corrupt the whole of the system thereafter. And that's what he was desperately trying to avoid. And he didn't know that you and your neighbour were kind of flying squad operatives, as it were, who could be allowed to go out on the rampage. He had to treat everybody in the same way, but above all, he had to preserve the integrity of the investigation.
Okay, I like the fact sticking up for him. Remember, I was federated ranks all my life.
A secret for you. I've got a secret for you, Simon. So was I. The great strength of the Scottish Police Service is that everybody starts in exactly the same place. And that's still the case. And for all the brought in graduate entry and flyers and all this sort of stuff, still in the police service in Scotland, everybody starts as a constable and everybody goes to Tullyallen Castle, a square bashing. And so you've got a common experience there right at the very start, and regardless of where you end up or what speciality you end up doing, actually, you all started there with that same experience. I think that's a wonderful thing. I hope no smart aleck ever tries to change that, because I think it would be fatal if they did.
Fingers crossed. Tom, we used to get a fire drill at Pitt Street maybe every month or so, I don't remember. We go off in the morning and we all had to parade out onto Pitt Street or Holland Street or West Regent Street, depending on where your muster was. and there'd be hundreds there. And there was people we had never seen before, in uniform and out of uniform, and all sorts of people appear on the street. And we used to say, there's a chief inspector. That's good. He's getting some street experience. Anyway, I take your point, and it's well made, and it's a big strength of our police force. So yes, I'm prepared to go so far in forgiveness, but not all the way, because when Jim and I went to him, we didn't go off on a tangent. We went to him. We did our research through the files on our own volition, and we plucked out, I don't actually remember now, I think it was about a dozen who fit the age. Remember, we had lots of parameters to go by as well, with age and description and whatnot. People who are not in prison, rules them out right away. So I think we went with about a dozen. And all we said to him was, boss, here's a dozen names we've plucked out of the female child unit who fit the parameters here, and they're perfectly capable of having been involved in this. Can we go and have a wee look at them? And he said, don't be so stupid. Get back out there, get on with your job. In fact, and this is the clincher, this is why I can't forgive him 100%. He said, I want you to go to the shops for me. And he sent us to the shops for him to get an anniversary card for his wife. It was his anniversary that day. And he let me and Jim Moffat pick it for him. We made sure we picked something appropriate, I can assure you. But I don't think he even looked at it. I don't think he was
So tell me then, what in your view was that about? What was that about? What was that transaction about?
What he did was totally take the wind out of our sails, tell us to get back in amongst the inquiry team. I don't think there was any threat involved to take us off the inquiry. All we wanted to do was put the names into the system, Tom. We weren't saying let us go and have a wee look at them. We were saying let's put these guys in the system here and make it part of what we're doing in this early investigation. And I learned in future inquiries that once we learned about Holmes, that first 2 or 3 days, he didn't even know Holmes was there, because what the good SIOs did was separate the two things. The incident room got managed and you weren't allowed anywhere near it. You didn't even know who was on the team in there. They were getting things up and running in the way they do, whilst we were getting the initial stages of the inquiry done, all those initial actions. I remember you telling me about a senior officer detective who thought the answer was always in those first 50 statements. And that's what I'm talking about. Is I'm a detective, so take my mind off the instant. Don't even worry about that, Simon. Here's what I want you to do. Go and take a statement from this person or whatever it might be.
Can I just interrupt and ask you, can I draw you back again to this interaction? Because I can picture the scene here. You've spoken about you and your neighbour being in machine gun mode. Is that how you went in to see the DCI?
No, not at all. No, at that point, we're seriously engaged with this inquiry. And there's an urgency to it because we think he's going to strike again at any time. So we were thinking there's an urgency here to get this done. Here's an idea that'll add to... We weren't saying we'll go and catch this guy. We were saying, here's some names that we've dug out in cahoots with the girls. We could have a look at them, put them in the system, and let's have a look at them straight away and see, maybe preempt the whole thing, which is exactly what we did.
Yeah, I mean, it just strikes me that what that was about was an exercise in humiliation. He wanted, for some reason, to humiliate you and put you in your place. In fact, not just put you in your place, the business about sending you out to get an anniversary card was actually to take you down a peg or two. I wonder why he did that. In terms of forming a squad, in terms of getting people to follow you, in terms of getting loyalty and commitment, that's not exactly out of the playbook.
No. And he must have known, well, he maybe didn't know, that Jim and I would be very influential. You can imagine that. You know me now, that I would be influential in the briefing and whatnot. If I'm on your side, then that would be a benefit to you, because I'm not scared to speak my mind. I would speak up. I would talk about what we were doing. Jim, even more so. And he was clever, and people knew that he was very smart. He was destined for the top at that point, Jim Moffat. He was younger than me, but he was very, very smart. So, yeah, your point's absolutely spot on. Remember that sneer that I told you about? It doesn't ingratiate you generally. And you couldn't get involved in a battle of wits with Jim Moffat because he was a machine gun. He was just... And even the DCI would probably realise that, and he just took us down a peg or two.
Yeah, it's interesting when you're handling a team or managing a squad. You've got to make sure that there's a whole lot of complementary things happening with it. What you cannot have, regardless of talent, you cannot have people who are disruptive. Because, as we've discussed before, this fiction of the master detective solving crimes, that's for the movies. The truth is that you need to have a team pulling together.
So Jim and I, let's come in at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. We'll pick the favourite name and go and chap his door and see where that takes us. And we did that every day. I think the third incident happened while we were doing this, which distracted us for a wee while. But I think we did that for 4 or 5 days, Tom. We came in a couple of hours early and we left an hour late to go over what we'd done that day and see who the next favourite was going to be. All the time we were talking to female child unit. I do remember talking to divisional collator before we went out and did any of these, because he always had an insight and other intelligence and whatnot. We would do warrants checks, we would do all that kind of stuff before we went out that morning. Maybe 6:30 every morning we were at somebody's door, chapping the door. But there was a DS in on it as well, because we weren't entirely stupid. There was a DS that we had told what we were doing, and I think he was the liaison that gave us the green light. If we gave him the name, he would give us the green light to go and have a wee go.
Okay, so presumably what he would be doing is he would be checking the database and he would make sure that you were not fouling up something that was already ongoing.
Yeah.
Right, okay.
So we were quite happy with the first 3 or 4, and then we hit a guy's door, Jim Smith, which is not his real name because he's still alive. And it was his mother that answered the door. And you get a vibe, don't you, when you go in the dark room and all the rest of it. Tom, we knew there was a warrant for him. We knew there was a warrant out for his arrest, but we didn't execute it at that point. We just wanted to get a vibe because we were right out in our wing here. And we had no intentions of doing this on our own. Don't get me wrong, we weren't thinking we'll walk into the office with this guy under arrest, detained for 6 hours, and we're going to blow the cake. That wasn't our intention at all. It was simply to identify a suspect that we could feed into the system. That was our master plan. Let's get a feel for this guy, check out his alibi as best we can or whatever, and if we're happy with him, fine. If we're not, let's feed it into the system and let the system take over from thereafter. That was the plan. He wasn't in that morning. It was his mum. She told us where he worked, etc., etc. A cold lead. He was working. We went to his place of work in Glasgow city centre. He was a labourer, and we spoke to his boss, who confirmed the second one he had been at his work. Solid alibi, and we went away quite happy initially. And I must admit, if it had been left to me, that would have been the end of it as far as Jim Smith was concerned, and we would have been on to a new suspect the next day. But for some reason, Moffat wasn't happy. And him and I used to argue about his hypotheses. He would love to look at a crime and say, oh, this could have happened, and then he did this, and then she didn't like that. So that made them all go down to the such and such. And then he had done it. You know, it was all supposition. And I would say, Jim, let's just do the inquiry. Let's just do the work, and we'll see where it pans out. You can see the two different approaches very, very clearly there. And on this occasion, we had done it, and I was quite happy with the alibi. And for some reason, Moffat wasn't. He didn't like the guy, he didn't get the right vibe, whatever it was. On the way back to the office in the car, he was unhappy. This is at 8 o'clock in the morning, we're going back to do our work. And during the course of the day, I said to him 2 or 3 times, are you still not? And there's something, blah, 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 whatever it was. I said, there's no good having that feeling, Jim. Let's go after work and get the foreman as he finishes work. So we were there at 4:30 outside this building site, and as the guy came out, I think he was just finishing, we just went over and huckled him into the car and never said a word to him, I don't think. Come with us, we're going to the office. And before we'd even driven away, he had said, wait a minute, lads, I've made a mistake. Turned out that his immediate supervisor, whatever, had stamped his card for him. The foreman we were speaking to had taken that as read, but once we left, he had gone and spoke to him and said, I don't remember seeing him that day. The truth had come out, but nobody was going to tell the police until Jim and I went back and rattled a cage. And all of a sudden, we had a different proposition here. Now, with hindsight, which is always a great thing, what we should have done was gone to the gaffer then. We should have then gone to the DCI. When we got back to the office, the day's wrapped up, if you like. Jim and I are on a mission. We've now got this guy in our sights. Never having set eyes on him yet. But we thought, here's my justification for it. Here's what I told my own super when he came back. We just wanted to put a wee bit of icing on it to make sure that we had something solid here, that we didn't just have an anomaly, because he could have been off his work for any number of reasons, truth be told. Just because Jim Moffat had a gut instinct about it didn't mean anything. So we went back to the office, and Jim, I'll blame him because he did it. He made up the card, the brown card with photographs on it. And we went and saw one of the victims, the first victim that night, phoned up, spoke to his mum, and we went up and saw him probably about 7 o'clock, 7:30 that night. Opened the card and showed the wee boy, and immediately the wee boy, his face went white. And he pointed straight at our Jim, and he said to his mum, "Mum, that's the man there. I still get hair standing up talking about that." He then went on to say, "And that's him there as well." Because Jim had put another one of them in it with a beard. Why he did that to this day, I have absolutely no idea. But he put 2 photos on the card, one with a beard and one without, which took us a wee bit explaining to the fiscal later on. But it was
I was going to say, I was looking forward to the fact that how you explained the identification process to the fiscal, and even more so if it went to the court. That would be interesting.
It was touch and go for a while. But luckily there was other victims and lots of other evidence. And as you'll learn just in a minute or two, it came to a happy ending as far as the accused was concerned. So we had a positive identification, calmed the parent down and the wee boy and told them that there was a procedure here. We'd need to go back and get advice and do this and do that, just to relax. And off we went back to the office and phoned the DS that had been party to what we were doing. We gave him a call. He was delighted, made his way into the office immediately and let him phone the DCI. And we were told to go home and not come back in the next day. And we did come in the next day. I came in on some pretext to get something, and I met Jim. I'd arranged to meet him at the office about 9 o'clock, long after the team had gone out on their day-to-day. The other side of the story is that 2 DSs went and arrested him on the warrant. Remember I told you there was an outstanding warrant for him? They went and arrested him 5:30, 6 in the morning, and before they'd got to Govan Police Office, which was about a 15-minute drive, he admitted everything in the back of the car. So it was signed, sealed and delivered from then on. Jim and I were about the office at 10 and were reminded that we shouldn't be there, that we should be at home until further notice. We weren't suspended, but I later found out that he wanted to suspend us. That's what the DCI wanted to do, but he was advised against it for whatever reason. You have better insight to that than I have. You'll understand that we were off work. We weren't the slightest bit concerned about the consequences. We were absolutely over the moon that we got this guy. Absolutely. Nothing could have tainted that, Tom. That's how naive we were and how stupid we were at the time. But because that was the job to us, that was all that mattered. How we got there, the hows and whys and whatever were by the by, that's somebody else's problem. So we weren't suspended, but we didn't get to the payoff. When an inquiry comes to a conclusion like that, then everybody gets a wee reward and taken for a drink together as a team, the whole team, the Holmes team, from uniforms that were involved in the inquiry, the locus, whatever. Everybody goes. SCRO are invited, anybody to a local bowling club or a Masonic lodge or whatever's handy within the division for everybody to go to. And the boss usually puts up a few quid and everybody gets a couple of drinks. Well, Jim and I never got invited. Our DCI tidied up the inquiry. We were allowed back to work. Remember, a couple of DOs had been working the book on their own probably for about 10 days by this point. And things go on. There's no let-up. It's still 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So we were back at work within 3 or 4 days after the payoff, and never another word was said about it until our own super came back. And he called Jim and I through to his office one afternoon towards the end of a shift. And we were in thinking we were going to get a shuriken from him as well. And he sat us down and he brought out a bottle and he poured us a wee dram and he said, "There you go, lads. I read and I saw what was going on. He wanted to suspend you, but that was put on back burner totally. Well done." And that was the end of it as far as we were concerned. Jim and I moved on. That's my story. Tom, 25th of August. Not far away now. You're coming through to Glasgow. What's going on? How can I get involved?
That's right, Simon. Sunday, the 25th of August at 2 o'clock, Hillhead Library. It's a live Crime Time Inc. podcast. How to get there? Our website, crimetimeinc.com. unveiling.com and you'll get tickets, and it's free.
Fantastic. And it's going fast, Tom, I can assure you of that. Can't wait. See you there.